Hi, my name is Todd Logan. I'm the Executive Director of the Stanford Digital Learning Forum, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to the Learning Forum seminar series. This is the fifth of a six-part seminar series, and we're very excited about this particular event. The format for tonight is that we're going to basically have a very brief introduction, followed by about a 40-minute presentation. We're going to have plenty of time for Q&A at the end. And then around 5:30, we'll break for a reception outside. Hopefully the discussions will continue out there over food and drink. So this seminar series is being recorded so that you could share it with your colleagues after the event. And I would like to introduce Tom D., professor in our Graduate School of Education, who will do the introductions.
Thank you, Todd, and welcome, folks. It's a pleasure to be here for the fifth of our year-long series of exciting talks and to introduce today's speaker, Caroline Hoxby. Caroline is the Scott and Danya Baumer Professor of Economics here at Stanford, a fellow with the Hoover Institution and with the Stanford Institute on Education Policy Research. She's also director of the Economics of Education program at the National Bureau of Economic Research. And as we're both economists who study education, I've known Caroline for some time. And I think I could say without fear of contradiction, she's, not only been providing important scholarship in the economics of education, but she's really been in the vanguard of reinventing the broader field of education research, integrating advanced quantitative methods, clear theoretical frames, and marrying them to questions of practical relevance. So I don't know that I could think of anyone I'd rather hear opine on today's topic, what is and what might be in the area of digitally mediated teaching and learning, than Caroline. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Caroline Hoxby.
Thanks, and thanks for that introduction. I'm just delighted to be here today and to talk about the economics of online education. And just to give you a sense, I know that a lot of the discussion about online education is about what I would call the logistical side. What are the platforms? What courses are people offering online? How can we do it? This is going to be more of a 10,000-foot view, because what we're going to try and do today is look at the industry of higher education, how its financial model works, how it is sustained, and then what online education what role online education is going to play in that. What models of higher education are going to be economically sustainable, economically thriving with online education. So that's what we're going to talk about today, and it is definitely a bit of a 10,000-foot view. I'm also really excited about hearing your questions at the end. I will just say as a preview that, like all economists, I love being asked questions, and I'm kind of offended if you don't ask questions. So please think of your questions as you go along. You will certainly not offend me. Okay, here's a little roadmap for the talk. I'm going to describe two different extremes of traditional American post-secondary education. That's what PE stands for, is post-secondary education. Non-selective post-secondary education, which from now on I'll abbreviate as NSPE, and highly selective post-secondary education, which I will abbreviate as HSPE. Okay? Now, why am I doing these two extremes? I'm doing the two extremes because although there's a very big middle between our type of higher education, which is the highly selective type, that's the Stanford universities of this world, okay, and the non-selective higher education, which are actually the vast majority of institutions in the United States. There's a big middle between those two, but the middle sort of fits between the two ends of the spectrum, and I don't have time to talk about the middle as well. So you'll get a sense of what the middle is like by my talking about the two extremes. I'm going to talk about the logic of each type of higher education and why each type is economically sustainable. They have quite different economic models behind them. And you can think of the middle as being an economic model or a financial model that's someplace between the two. I'm going to say just a little bit on the evidence for each model so that you don't think I'm just describing the way I think they are. I'm going to try and convince you that I know the facts, okay? If you want lots of detailed evidence, it's in some papers that are linked to the last slide. And then I'm going to assess how it is that online education would work with these two different models. I think that's really the core of the paper. and especially whether it is financially sustainable with the sort of way in which these institutions work. And then I'm going to end on a upbeat note with an adventurous but still economically sustainable model for online education in highly selective post-secondary education. Now, just to give you a sense of the American industry of higher education, we have about 8,000 institutions in the United States. Highly selective post-secondary education institutions like Stanford, roughly 200 of those 8,000 institutions fit into this highly selective category, and they're also fairly small relative to some of the other institutions, so it's not 200 of 8,000 where we're the same size as the others. Actually, we're substantially smaller than some of the other big state institutions. So out of the 8,000 institutions, the percentage of them that's non-selective is just over half. Okay, so non-selective post-secondary education represents the majority of post-secondary education in the United States. Highly selective is kind of like it's the tip of the iceberg in some sense, okay? But it's important, especially for a place like this. Okay, so what is non-selective post-secondary education? It is essentially the selling of education to people in exchange for someone paying their tuition and fees. It's a pretty simple world, okay? The typical post-secondary course in non-selective education just covers standardized material. Their courses are designed for students who have a high school degree or a GED, in other words, an equivalency for a high school degree, but not much of anything else necessarily. And they do not require that students apply through an admissions process with essays and standardized test scores and high school transcripts and things like that. You just need to have a high school degree. Because they offer fairly standardized courses, as we will see, and they tend to employ instructors of whom there is an elastic supply. In other words, you can go out and find more instructors for your non-selective post-secondary school. As a rule, their cost is fairly low. Okay, and the full cost of your typical non-selective post-secondary institution can be covered by federal grants, federal loans, and families' resources. So there is some borrowing for this type of education, but most people can pay for it up front. Okay, in other words, with loans, family, they're going to pay for it up front when they actually get the education. There's little intrinsic reason for students to take all of their courses at the same institution because the courses are fairly standardized. I mean, Algebra 1 doesn't really change that much from institution to institution. Okay, that turns out Algebra 1, I will come back to that, is the most commonly taken course in American post-secondary education. And the courses that they do offer in specialized subjects tend to lead to certificates that are granted by outside bodies. Okay, so I could get a certificate granted by an engineering or technical association or a health association or something like that. Some type of a nursing or nurse's aid certificate would be quite common. And it turns out that it is the certificates and not the degrees that really explain whether or not you get returns for non-selective post-secondary education. Okay, highly selective post-secondary education institutions like this and our peer institutions, we're really different. We're right at the other end of the spectrum. I like to describe us as venture capitalists in advanced human capital, where economists like to use the word human capital to remind us that education is a type of capital. It's an asset that pays off for a person's whole lifetime. Okay. Our type of institution, we invest massively in students, and we end up getting returns from students. In other words, we support these massive investments that we make in students by earning something that looks a lot like an equity return. So let me just remind you of what venture capitalists do. Venture capitalists go out and they find a good investment project, right? And they are people who are expert enough to know whether the investment project is a good investment project or a lousy investment project. They don't earn a good rate of return on every single one of their projects, but on average, if they're good venture capitalists, they earn a good return. And on the projects that make a lot of money, they get back a lot of money. And on the projects that don't make any money, they don't get back anything. But they earn an equity-like return, a percentage return on the earnings associated with their investments. Okay? That is essentially the model that institutions like ours use. We make massive investments in students. Our students have a wide array of outcomes. On average, they're very good, and we tend to earn an equity-like return in them in the sense that people don't return to us always exactly what we invested in them. Instead, they tend to return some share of the returns that they perceive. Okay? So we cover the vast majority of the cost of a student's undergraduate education, about 80%, and that's also what our peer institutions cover. Right? So we're not unusual in that, but this is our special group of peer institutions. Even our students who receive no financial aid do not cover the majority of the cost of their undergraduate education, where what we're talking about is instructional costs, student services, academic support, things like that. I'm not talking about research. Okay, research is totally off the table, public service, other things that universities do, not including that in the cost. What we see is that they donate a share of what they perceive to be their returns from having gone to a certain undergraduate school, and most donations occur decades after graduation. In fact, the typical time when I like to say we go into the black on a class is about 35 years after they have graduated. So for the first 35 years, we have invested so much in our undergraduates that we are still in the red, and after about 35 years, the class will catch up, 35, 40 years, the class will catch up, and we'll start to be in the black. Okay, that's a way to think about what it is that we do. And it's important that our alumni perceive that they got something out of the institution, because after all, they don't have to donate to us 35 years from now. Okay, if they don't see the link, if they don't see that what we're doing makes sense, they're not going to give us donations. They're not going to help us out in the many other ways that they can help us apart from donations. It's not just donations, but many other ways. Our alumni earn returns that are highly right skewed. In other words, they have a very long right-hand tail. If you were to look at the distribution of earnings among our alumni, that's typical for high-income people. We have high-income alumni. So it matters that we have donations that are a share of their returns and not some fixed amount of money, like $100,000 or $200,000. It matters that it's a share, okay, because we need to have that. All right, so we have used this method of financing education for quite a long time, but we didn't choose it on purpose. I think we just sort of fell into it. I'm not under the impression that someone thought it up in a logical ex-ante way. It just happened that we ended up doing it this way. And we do it for the same reason that venture capitalists exist. That is that it would be very difficult for most of our students to actually pay for their undergraduate education up front. Most of our undergraduates and their families do not have the wherewithal to pay the full cost of a Stanford undergraduate education while they are getting the education, even if they could get all of the loans that are available, private loans, federal loans, things like that, okay? It's just not possible without the sort of financial aid that we give them. So about 90% of the students in this area could not finance their own undergraduate education. They would exhaust their capacity to do that. So we have to act a bit like a venture capitalist and make the investments in them, and we have to be smart about investing in students. We have to know who to invest in. We also, like a venture capitalist that also matches their entrepreneurs with specialized resources to make sure that the investment works out, we do the same thing. We call them labs and libraries and professors and things like that. But we match them with specialized resources that are very, very hard to build from scratch. If you want to start another Stanford University today, or another Harvard University today, and create all of those labs and libraries and faculty, all I have to say to you is, good luck to you, okay? It's not going to work. All right, so it's very difficult to build a university from scratch. It's not impossible, but it's very difficult. Right? And a final advantage of this venture capital model is that we share risk across our portfolio of students. So just like a venture capitalist has a portfolio of investments, we have a portfolio of students. So now, as a logical matter, it's important that we do a couple of different things as a highly selective institution. First, it's important that we actually infuse value added into our students. Okay, it's not good enough. I know sometimes people think this isn't true, but it's not good enough that we merely have students enjoy getting an undergraduate education. That's not good enough. Because if that's all that we're doing, then on average, they're not going to earn any more than their parents earned. And then they won't be able to pay back the investment that we made in them. Because otherwise, if that were true, their parents could have paid us. Okay, so as a logical matter, we must infuse value added into students, and it must be proportionate to the investments that we make in them. Therefore, we actually have to be selective. We cannot be giving out these investments to just anybody. If 80% of the cost of a Stanford education comes from us, we better choose who's going to get that 80%. Okay, it's on the order, the cost of an undergraduate education at an average highly selective post-secondary institution in the United States is now just about $100,000 a year per student. I've rounded up just a little bit, but that's about right. That's instructional spending, academic support, student support, and the other things that are directly attributable to undergraduate education. So it's an expensive undertaking. We have no way to enforce repayment of our investment, obviously. You can't send someone a bill after 35 years and say, gee, it's time to pay back. Okay? So therefore, it must be the case that our alumni actually believe in what it is that we're doing, not just now, but for years. Right? They still have to believe in it 35 years from now, because that's when they're going to be giving back a lot of their money. So it is important that institutions like ours have judgment methods and missions that actually ensure that our students want to be part of the financial model that makes us sustainable. Right? We can't be inauthentic in some sense. We have to actually do what it is that we promise. There's no magic formula for creating what I think of as this virtuous intergenerational cycle where each generation of students provides the educational resources for the next generation of students to be educated. But what are the key things that make this work? Well, first, you need to have instructor and student relationships that are important and student-student relationships that are important. Those are the things that make you remember the place. We need to have interactions that combine intellectual and social experiences. It's not merely like that meeting your professor was the same as reading his book. There needs to be something different about that so that people are excited about Stanford and not merely a book. We need to have our alumni trace their success to the advantages they received as students. That doesn't necessarily mean only intellectual advantages, but the whole broad array of things that they got while they were at places like this. And then we need to have the mission of these institutions to advance world or social welfare be authentic, because people will not want to help the next generation of students, of researchers, and so on, if they do not believe that we're authentically engaged in that mission. So sometimes people think, oh, this seems like this is so, this is a way of thinking about the university that's very, I don't know, just very rigorous or harsh or something like that. It doesn't seem like it's about, the universities seem to me like there are these beautiful blossoming things about intellectual life. Well, they had better be, okay? They had better be beautiful, blossoming intellectual things, because it's that authentic mission that actually makes universities like ours work. Okay, so I'm going to look very briefly at some evidence so that you understand that I haven't just characterized these two types of institutions in a casual way, but I actually looked at all the facts. So I'm going to look at the degree to which costs are paid for upfront, standardized versus advanced content, multiple choice testing, and things like that. Many people versus few people being competent to explicate the material. This is basically about the faculty. I'm going to look at interactions between instructors and students and students and students. The phenomena of dropping out, being a part-time student, and attending multiple institutions in your undergraduate career. The prevalence of old-style distance education. By this, I mean things as old-style as watching a video on television, or maybe even having a correspondence course. Instructors' experience with students who are diverse in aptitude and preparation. This differs a lot. And then finally, certificates versus an integral degree, such as our undergraduate degree. Okay, first, let's talk about the degree to which the costs are paid for upfront. At non-selective post-secondary institutions, income from endowment and gifts covers only about 1% of the cost of undergraduate education. It is trivial in importance. Okay, basically, everything is paid for by tuition and fee payments, which are made by students at the time they are attending undergraduate education. Now, some of those may come from loans or grants, but they're paid for at the time. Okay, they're paid for upfront. If you look at our institutions, I've already said this, basically, income from endowments and gifts covers about 81% of the cost of an undergraduate education, and tuition and fees are about 17%, and then there's some other sources that make up the rest. Okay, that's on average for the highly selective post-secondary sector. And even our full-pay students, in other words, the ones who are getting no financial aid at all, are covering only about 48% of the cost of their education on average in our sector. All right, so now let's talk about standardized versus advanced or original content. About 36% of non-selective post-secondary education courses cover material that is in a standard textbook, okay, where we could just walk down to any bookstore and find the textbook. So the most common course, as I mentioned, is pre-collegiate algebra, or Algebra 1. It not only is the most common course, it accounts for 6.5% of all post-secondary course taking in the United States, okay, across all post-secondary institutions. That tells you that's a very standardized course. Basic accounting is the next most popular, reading comprehension, introductory US history, introductory literature. These are common courses that are taken in non-selective post-secondary institutions, and they're typically taught from a textbook, all right? In contrast, 72% of the courses in the highly selective sector include material that is in no textbook. It is not merely that they are not standardized courses that only use a textbook part of the time. They include material that just isn't in textbooks at all. Okay, it is original material, it is new material. The faculty who are teaching it are the people who are doing the research such that they can talk about that relatively new cutting edge material. So there's a very big difference between what you're going to see in those two types of classes. What about testing and grading and things like this? This matters a lot in online education, as we all know. In non-selective post-secondary education, about 70% of all testing is multiple choice testing, and about 36% of the courses have the students grade one another's work. Only 5% of work is graded by the instructor. Okay? At the opposite end of the spectrum, if you ask students in highly selective institutions to report on, did you have assignments over the course of your undergraduate career in which it was graded by the instructor and you got individualized feedback, 100% of them report that that's true. Okay? Whether they read the individualized feedback, I don't know, but anyway, they say they get it. Okay. All right, what percentage of people are competent to explicate the material, are competent to teach at these institutions? Well, maybe more are competent to teach than we know, but there's certainly very different types of instructors. Your typical non-selective post-secondary education instructor has basically no publications. Okay, they really don't do research, and only 6% of them have a PhD from a competitive university. At the opposite end of the spectrum, the faculty at a place like this have 20 times more publications, and they're about 10 times more likely to have a PhD from a competitive university. So they're quite different ends of the spectrum. This type of person is harder to find, obviously, than the type of instructor at a non-selective institution. Interactions. I think this is one of the single most important things. This comes from students' self-reports of their interactions with faculty and other students, and also faculty reports of their interactions with students, but it's largely based on students' self-reports. So they add up all these questions that they ask students and come up with something called an index of academic integration that asks them a whole series of different questions about what it is that they do. So the average student in a highly selective institution has a score that is on this index that's more than a standard deviation above that of a student in a non-selective institution. And that reflects things like they are many times more likely to meet with faculty, to meet with academic advisors, to have study groups that contain other students, and so forth. If you look at social integration, the difference is even wider. It's 2 standard deviations on the index of social integration. And that reflects things like the fact that students at highly selective institutions are much more likely to engage in cultural activities with their fellow students. They're more likely to play in the band, the orchestra, be in theater, do intercollegiate sports, do non-intercollegiate sports, school clubs, and the like. Okay, so their social integration is very different as well as their academic integration. What about dropping out, being a part-time student, attending multiple institutions? Here again, the behavior is incredibly different. And if you have spent all of your time at highly selective institutions, you really have a strange picture of American undergraduate education. So first, let's look at what the non-selective typical student does. 7% of them get a BA, a baccalaureate degree, within 5 years. 7%. Okay, that's on-time completion. 7% is the typical rate. Right? 14% get an associate's degree within 5 years. 59% attend part-time. So being part-time is the norm, not the exception. Just about half of them stop out. Stopping out means you leave for at least one term. You might come back, but people are actually leaving. They're not doing study abroad or something like that. They're just leaving undergraduate education. And about half attend more than one institution for their undergraduate education. It's quite common for people to start off at one institution, sort of mill around and take a variety of different courses at other institutions and paste them all together on a transcript at the end of the day to get their degree if they end up getting a degree, which we've seen is not the majority of people. Right? If you look at an institution like this, you would think that the following things were the norm: full-time, being a full-time student, attending nonstop without taking off lots of terms, and graduating on time. So just the opposite ends of the spectrum. But we're the unusual ones. That's the norm for non-selective institutions. Old-style distance education was already somewhat common at non-selective institutions, really even going back into the 1970s and 80s, although it was more like correspondence courses. But by 1990, 13% of all courses at those institutions were taught by distance education. It would seem crude by today's online education standards, but they were doing it. Today, it's about 15% of all courses at these institutions are taught by online or other distant means. That does not mean flipped classrooms. These would be truly distant. They don't ask about flipped classrooms in the sort of questionnaires we have for institutions. If you look at old-style distance education, it's traditionally been negligible in the highly selective sector, and even today it only represents about 1% of courses. So again, they're in quite different places. It's been obvious that distance education has been able to thrive in the non-selective sector, less obvious in the highly selective sector. Here's something that I think those of us who are faculty at highly selective institutions, we need to be a little modest about how good we are at teaching people. Why? Because we don't actually teach a very diverse pool of students. If I were to teach today at a non-selective institution, I would teach a very diverse pool of students. While most of their students are in sort of the 30th to the 45th percentile in terms of incoming student preparation, they have all kinds of students who are below that and students who are above that. It's a very diverse population of students. Most of them are in this range, but by no means all of them are in this range. Our students are not diverse at all. Okay? The vast majority of them are at or above the 93rd percentile in terms of preparation, and in fact, the vast majority are really a bit above that, above the 95th percentile. So someone like me who has spent my entire teaching life teaching at places like Harvard and Stanford really I've never met a student in higher education who's at the 50th percentile. Or I've never taught one. I may have met them, but I have not ever taught them. So the notion that people like me are actually good at teaching students who are diverse is, how would we know? I mean, I have no experience, so don't trust me to do it. Okay. And then my final point on evidence is the difference in whether it's the degree that matters or something like a certificate that matters. We're used to the idea that it's the degree that matters in highly selective post-secondary education, that what matters is getting a Stanford degree. Okay? But actually, in non-selective post-secondary education, what really pays rewards in terms of earnings are getting certificates. And it matters much less which one of these institutions you go to. In fact, you haven't heard of most of these institutions, right? I bet none of you could name 8,000 institutions in the United States. So certainly you have not heard of the vast majority of them. That means that the certificate, which is granted by an outside body, like an association, is actually what earns rewards. And there's some facts on that. Okay, you all know what MOOCs are, massive, open, online courses. But I'll just, for those who somehow have missed out on what MOOCs are, let me just remind you of what it is that they do, because we're going to talk about how MOOCs fit into these two different models, non-selective and highly selective. They have open enrollment as a rule. They do online assessments that can be easily graded, usually machine graded, but not always machine graded. By machine graded, I mean they could be graded by a computer. They often contain interactive forums in which students can help one another. Students often help to assess one another's work, not always, but they sometimes do that. Your typical MOOC has a high dropout rate, which is sort of sensible because the cost of trying a MOOC is low. So if I'm trying a MOOC, so I can drop out, and what have I lost? A small amount of money, perhaps some effort, and I might have learned something from that effort. Okay. What is precluded in MOOCs are the following types of things, and it's precisely because they're not compatible with the massive nature. Now, you can have an online course that is not a MOOC. In other words, it's not a massive open online course. It's just an online course, and it could have these things. But a MOOC, if it's going to be a MOOC, cannot have these things. It cannot have intensive faculty-student interaction. There's no faculty member who can intensively interact with 10,000 students or 100,000 students. Student-to-student interaction cannot be heavily moderated by the faculty. Yes, they can do a little light moderation, okay, but they can't be moderating all the interactions among students. They have to use forms of assessment that do not require the faculty to engage with students on an individual basis. The faculty cannot be grading individual papers, for instance. The students can't use any resource that doesn't have a marginal cost close to zero, because the nature of a MOOC is that it can't say to someone, well, the course is free, but by the way, you have to go use this resource that's going to cost you, $18,000 or something like that. And students can't need to use infrastructure that's only available at institutions like ours. So you can't run a MOOC and say, and by the way, you need to have access to the Stanford labs. Okay, that's not workable. Right? So that's MOOCs. Now, are MOOCs good substitutes for non-selective post-secondary education? Well, yes, at least for a part of it, and maybe for a lot of it. Okay? They certainly are substitutes for the 15% that's already offered as distance education. They're just a better version than old-fashioned distance education. I think anyone would agree to that. Okay? They just have many advantages that sort of distance education didn't have: the spontaneity, the simultaneity, the advantages for interaction, all the kinds of things that make online education very different from just a video. They are also possibly good substitutes for a lot of the other standardized education that takes place at a non-selective post-secondary institution. So let's think back to Algebra 1 or pre-collegiate algebra. Well, is it better to be taught that by a MOOC, or is it better to be taught that in person? Well, that sort of depends. I don't know that there's a right answer to that question. I could have one charismatic, amazing instructor of pre-collegiate algebra who was teaching it to hundreds of thousands of students around the world and knew exactly the right examples, the right way to explain things, made it all crystal clear to people. Although the fact that they're still taking algebra in college tells you that perhaps crystal clarity is going to be not just enough, but let's hope, okay? Is that better than having, your sort of run-of-the-mill instructor, but having that interaction, having the opportunity to ask a question when it arises, as you're going over something in your math class? I don't know the answer to that question, but it seems plausible that the one charismatic great communicator might be better. It's at least plausible. And MOOCs are potentially very good substitutes for a lot of certificated programs that lead to a certificate. We know we actually see a lot of MOOCs doing that right now. Okay? And why is it a good substitute? It's because really, if you think about non-selective post-secondary education, it already resembles MOOCs in certain key ways. It is easy to grade assessments. There's not very much interaction. The students don't feel academically or socially integrated, particularly, so they're not losing out on that. And if there's dropping out and low adherence to the course, well, that was already part of non-selective post-secondary education. That's not a change. There is some problems with financial sustainability, however, and that's because in traditional non-selective post-secondary education, the institution can ensure that it gets paid. Okay, that's pretty simple. If I show up at a community college in this area, they do not actually let me take courses unless I pay them. Okay, so I still have to pay my term bills and so forth, or I cannot take courses. But MOOCs don't have very much protection against content theft and underselling. So for instance, if you talk to anyone who is the head of an online platform today, they will tell you that although they try to have barriers to people scraping the content off their websites, they don't have profound barriers to people doing that. So they couldn't discourage someone who was really determined and willing to invest some time and money in scraping. And this is the same problem that the film industry has and the recording industry has. People can scrape content if they're interested in doing it, and these two industries, which are quite sophisticated, do not have a solution to that problem. What they have done is they've just priced their content so cheaply, sort of like iTunes, very cheap content, so that people aren't very tempted to scrape. But that doesn't mean that if they were to price their content much and make it much more expensive, people wouldn't scrape. People would. Okay? There's really no defense to that. Now, so that is going to mean that MOOCs are going to have difficulty pricing pretty highly. And Therefore, it may be that MOOCs are not going to substitute that well for non-selective post-secondary education because the financial models are not really the same, right? Community colleges, they can charge anyone who walks in the door. MOOCs, it's not so obvious that they can charge more than a little bit. In addition, right now, the MOOCs that we see are not an economically sustainable model. And I will emphasize this again, and I'd be glad to talk about it again in the question period. We are in a funny transition period where a lot of people who have very expensive to create content and who are what I would call the, well, teaching stars of one form or another, or research stars, are giving away their content for free. Okay, that is not a sustainable model. Really, no one gives away things for free over very long periods of time. People might do it temporarily while they're thinking about this industry getting established, but nobody does it over a long period of time. It reminds me of the early Hollywood situation when it was the studios and not the stars who took the profits. But if I'm running a MOOC and it attracts 200,000 students and I'm the attraction, why should I not get paid the profits? Why should a platform get paid the profits, right? And just like Hollywood stars now get paid the profits, not the studios. There's no longer are the studios capturing the profits. Tom Cruise gets paid for doing his movies, okay? So this is not a sustainable model. And that's quite important to understand that today's MOOCs are not going to exist. They may exist in some other form, but they're not going to exist in the current form, which is they get content largely for free. So, and this tendency of post-secondary institutions to give away content for free is probably from the point of view of an economist, it makes it very difficult to estimate what the supply of content is to online education. But all I can say is it's not the current supply. Okay, let's talk about the other end of the spectrum, MOOCs and highly selective post-secondary education. So MOOCs can certainly substitute for some of our courses. We do teach courses at a place like this that I would call service courses. Okay, those are straightforward courses that many undergraduates need to take when they arrive. An example would be introductory statistics or some of the introductory math courses. But these courses, it turns out, are already quite cheap. Why? Because they're often taught by instructors or they're taught in pretty massive settings. So we can teach them via MOOCs instead of teaching them in person, but they don't really account for why it is that a place like Stanford or Harvard or University of Chicago is expensive. Okay, that's not the reason why we're a costly type of institution. But the rest of our courses that are not of that sort of service course type, they're not very similar to MOOCs. Now, I didn't say they couldn't be made into online courses. We'll come back to that, but they're not similar to MOOCs. And why? Because MOOCs have negligible interaction with the faculty, whereas most of our other courses have quite a bit of interaction. In a MOOC, your interaction with other students is not going to be very uniform because the other students are not uniformly well prepared. Okay, some of them will be well prepared, some will be poorly prepared, but it's not like Stanford where you can walk into a classroom and assume that the other students are going to be similarly well prepared and that they will have read the material, they'll have done their homework, they're going to be able to engage in classroom discussion, for instance. We use complex assessments here, which cannot be used in MOOCs because they're simply not gradable on a massive scale. And we have a lot of assignments that use a specialized infrastructure and resources that you just couldn't have in a MOOC. I mean, it's normal for me to send my students down to use things in the library that just don't exist in most universities in the world. In fact, in about 90% of universities in the world. And anyone who does science here or engineering here is using resources that just don't exist in the vast majority of resources. Okay, so let's go through a little thought experiment, and I'm going to apply it to the, as people like to call it here, the Stanford of the East, Harvard. Okay, so that you don't, so that nobody feels that this is too personal. Right? So I chose Harvard for that reason, but also because Harvard has a very simple course structure, unlike our complicated course-taking structure. Okay, so I have 4 students, student A, B, C, and D. They're going to do 4 different types of things. Student A is not going to apply to Harvard at all. But student A is going to take 32 courses. That's how many you need to graduate at Harvard. It's going to take 32 courses, and at the cost of however much Harvard charges for its MOOCs. Let's say $200 a course, $500 a course, whatever is being charged. Remember, you can't charge very much for MOOCs because people start scraping them. All right? So we don't know how much it costs to create those courses to Harvard, but it's a heck of a lot more than $200 or $500 or something like that. If it were $200 or $500, Harvard would be a much cheaper education than it is today. But there's a lot of cost that is poured into creating the content that is in a Harvard course. So that's what student A does. Now student B is admitted to Harvard. So she applies to Harvard, she gets admitted, but she doesn't actually bother to go. Instead she says, okay, what do I have? I have my letter of admissions, which says, Sally, you were admitted to Harvard University. And I take my 32 MOOCs. So now what is different between her and a student who actually goes to Harvard and takes 32 MOOCs? Only one thing, it's that she has a letter of admission instead of having a letter that says, or a certificate that looks like this, that says you have a degree from Harvard. But it turns out, that about 98% of people who get admitted to Harvard graduate from Harvard. So there really is not a difference between those two certificates, right? The letter and the certificate, pretty much the same thing from the point of view of an employer. And she's taken her 32 MOOCs, okay? So she has the equivalent of a Harvard degree. Student C gets admitted to Harvard. She actually attends. She doesn't bother to take any of her courses in person. She loves the online model. So she takes 32 MOOCs, okay? And it costs her $240,000. And it costs Harvard about $500,000. Okay. All right, so that's student C. Notice the only difference between student B and student C is one of them has the letter of admission only, and the other one has a letter of admission and a diploma. Okay. And student D is admitted to Harvard and attends and successfully completes 32 traditional sort of in-person courses, or courses that don't fit the MOOC model anyway. They might be partly online, but they're not MOOCs, okay? All right, and also pays $240,000 at a full cost of about $500,000. All right, so now that's my thought experiment. No one sensible would ever agree to be student C. Why? Because student C and student B are basically indistinguishable from one another. They've taken exactly the same set of courses. No employer is going to say, oh, I will pay you so much more to be student C than student B. They look the same. Okay? They have the same probability of having graduated. Basically, everything else is the same. So we could reduce the prices for the person who is student C who only took MOOCs. Okay? But then that would just make us raise prices for student D because we have to create the content for those courses. And what we're going to end up with is a tragedy of the commons where no one will want to pay for the creation of course content that other people can get for free. That is the tragedy of the commons. If we give it to some people for free, then everyone will say, I want it for free too. No one wants to pay for the fixed cost of creating the course content, which is very expensive at a highly selective institution, right? Getting faculty who are the researchers, who come up with the new courses, who do all of these innovative things is not free. So that means that Harvard wouldn't be able to give course credit in a sustainable way, in an economically sustainable way for its MOOCs. Now, it could say, OK, that's fine. We're not going to give them course credit. And we're just going to say they're not really the same as a Harvard course. OK, they're not sufficiently engaging. Maybe they're not sufficiently challenging. They're just different than a Harvard course. You can come to Harvard and take a Harvard course, or you can take a Harvard MOOC, but they're not substitutes for one another. But if that's true, then why are Harvard faculty using their very scarce and valuable time to teach MOOCs rather than on the thing that they do best, which is this more complex teaching? Right? It begs the question, why are they doing the MOOCs if they're not really sufficiently engaging or challenging? So you have to sort of ask, OK, what's the goal there? And in my opinion, now this is an opinion, but it is based on my knowing a lot about post-secondary education, I don't think Harvard faculty are particularly good at teaching the masses. I was a Harvard faculty member. I don't think I was good at it. And I don't think I'm good at it now. I told you, I have no experience. OK, so I don't believe I even have an absolute advantage in teaching a diverse pool of students, and I certainly have no comparative advantage in teaching a diverse pool of students. Whoops, I think I went the wrong way. All right, so more importantly, making MOOCs very prevalent would collapse our financial model and giving them course credit in highly selective post-secondary education. So even though students C and D are not paying for the full cost of their education, right? They're only paying for a little less than half. They should feel like mugs. Why? Because the university is giving away the same type of education that they're getting basically almost for free. And that's going to get rid of that intergenerational virtuous cycle that I talked about. And I said it was so important for sustaining institutions that are of the highly selective type. Okay? I won't bother to talk about this last point. We could come back to that. And we'll also talk about those later. So now let me just conclude by talking about, so I've sort of said MOOCs don't really seem compatible with highly selective post-secondary education, not MOOCs, right? However, that doesn't mean all online education is not compatible. So let's talk about what type of online education is economically sustainable in highly selective post-secondary education. Because we can't just not be on the boat, right? I mean, we have to, this is the world today, everything is going online, so we have to be part of it. But the question is, how do we be part of it in a way that makes use of what we do well, that makes use of our comparative advantages in highly selective education, that takes account of the fact that we do have an expensive education. It does cost a lot of money to create the sort of education we give people. Well, we can create tradable online courses and limit them to equally qualified outside students. This would allow us to maintain the quality of the interaction in our courses. So we would be trading them or selling them to students who were similar to our students in preparation and aptitude. Okay, not everybody, but there's still a lot of students similar to ours out there who are not at these institutions right now. Think of 10 times as many students, 100 times as many students, 1,000 times as many students, but not 1,000,000 times as many students. Okay, that's an important distinction. There may be 1,000 times as many students, but there are certainly not 1,000,000 times as many students as are currently attending this set of institutions. We could sell these courses to the students of institutions that guarantee aptitude and preparation equal to that of what I'm going to call the exporting school, in other words, the school that created the course. So right now, we could start selling courses to other highly selective post-secondary institutions that just don't have that specialized course. And there are a lot of courses like that. Lots and lots of Stanford courses. There is no parallel course at our other peer institutions. And they have courses that we have no parallel to here. We could sell them to institutions that would provide local support from instructors who are trusted by the exporting faculty members. So by this, I mean something quite specific. Let me give you a concrete example. There are a bunch of wonderful students in Turkey. Only so many of them can come and visit here. That's not because they're not qualified or they're not well prepared or they aren't high in aptitude. It's just we only have so much space and so many faculty resources. But do I trust some of the faculty at Turkish institutions and think that they're fantastic people and that they can choose students who should be able to take my course? Oh yes, I definitely do. And they could provide the local support, and I would know that they were doing the selection well because I actually know them. Okay, so that's not an uncommon example. There are lots and lots of examples like that. We could sell the courses at a sustainable cost, which would need to include the cost of content creation. And their home institutions could continue to set the requirements, grant their degrees, and control the other aspects of their education. So we wouldn't have to worry too much about whether they were ending up with a Stanford degree or a degree from the Paris School of Economics or something else. Many liberal arts colleges and foreign institutions are capable of supporting that type of traded course or a course that they buy, but not necessarily capable of creating the course themselves. Okay, that's very common for the top research universities. We can create very specialized courses. The institutions in the highly selective group could teach many, many more students around the world who could benefit from our education. As I say, 100 times more students is totally plausible. Okay, but that is not the same as becoming mass educators of people who are not prepared for our type of education. That, I think, is not realistic. So those are two different types of things. You can reach many more, but you have to be clear about who it is that you're trying to reach. Now, given how concentrated expert faculty are in American universities, the concentration of the expert faculty in the world at American institutions is incredible. Okay, a lot of the great faculty in the world are here at American institutions. They're not necessarily Americans. In fact, most of them aren't Americans. But they're in American institutions. Almost all of the highly selective institutions in the United States would probably be net exporters in the sense that they would sell more courses than they would buy. All right, so we have some good news and some bad news, and this is where I'm going to conclude. I think in the early days of online education, people thought, aha, online education, it'll be massive. We can educate the world, and it will all be educated to a Harvard, Stanford, Yale, University of Chicago, Berkeley standard. Okay, I think that is completely naive. I think it's wrong for many reasons, but economically, it is just not a sustainable. It's not a sustainable model. Nevertheless, online post-secondary education might allow a lot of non-selective post-secondary institutions to meet rising demand from modestly prepared students who really do dominate the world's students. This is going to be sort of a low-margin business, but it's going to have tremendous social benefits, and I'm all for it. But it's not a business in which institutions like ours actually have much of a comparative advantage. But for institutions like the highly selective ones, online post-secondary education could allow institutions like ours to reach an order of magnitude or 2 orders of magnitude more students who are able to benefit from what it is that we do really well. That's a huge, huge improvement, right? It's a huge improvement for the world, but we need to set up the market well so that it thrives rather than collapses. And that means setting up the market in a way that is economically sustainable. And that probably means not giving away too much for free, as we talked about. So this is where I'm going to stop, and I'm going to be delighted to take questions.
I'm the guy with the microphone. You bet.
Ross Schachter from Management Science. I got two related questions. Is there also a market from the HSPE classes for the alumni, those alumni who you want to cultivate and eventually harvest, or however you described it? So is that a viable economic model for some of this? And what is the motivation for faculty who are very eager and proud of the size of their MOOCs? If it's not economically rational, is it just ego? What is your hypothesis for why people are so proud of the size of their MOOCs?
Well, the first question is an easy one. The second one is kind of a psychological one. You should never ask psychological questions of economists. Right? Okay, so, but I'll try to give you an answer nevertheless. On the first one, yes, I absolutely think that online courses are a great way to engage alumni, right? We know our alumni have a certain level of preparation. They also understand the nature of instruction at a place like Stanford. They've had a relationship with the university already. Keeping them engaged, fabulous. I mean, they want to stay engaged. They're people who like learning. That's absolutely a great thing to do. Now, whether you want to have them taking courses that are very oriented towards a student who's working full-time on something and has the time to do that is a different matter. I think having courses that are designed more for them, as opposed to a student who's working full-time, could be. But yes, I think it's a fabulous idea. Okay. And also the alumni of other institutions. Why not trying to get some of them to like us too? Okay, in terms of why it is that people like teaching MOOCs and like having a lot of people take their MOOCs, well, I don't think it's that different than people who like writing an introductory textbook that sells a lot of copies, okay? There are differences between the economics and the economic incentives of our institutions and the economic incentives of the individual faculty member. They are not entirely aligned, okay? So if I were to write an introductory textbook in economics, especially one that was not oriented towards our sort of students, but oriented more towards the mass education. So I said, I'm not gonna write one for students who are highly prepared, like our students in mathematically apt. I'm gonna write one that has no hard math in it, since we know that everyone doesn't know Algebra 1, okay? Because I wanna sell more copies. That would be good for me. But whether my dean would like that, my using my time that way is a different matter, because it would be good for me, but I doubt it would do much good for Stanford University.
Hi, Betsy Williams here at the Ed School. I really enjoyed this talk, and I'm wondering about the role of philanthropy, actually, in advancing things a little more. I could also, for instance, my advisor is creating a series of MOOCs that are funded largely by foundations because they're doing professional development for teachers. So there's sort of another niche in there for places that are still open, but really only sort of targeted in their interest. And sometimes you have foundations that will be sort of interested in that. And another motivation I'm sort of playing around with for professors to actually do highly selective style classes is for things like math or science in America, where you might have you've written about the missing one-offs who are scattered across the country and could really benefit from college-level classes that are advanced and are ready to take them into a sort of more advanced mindset. But unless they're developed by top professors, taking some of those classes early at a local community college might not be as much of a leg up for them. But it could be an investment in the future college goers.
Right. Okay, so let me answer the second question first. Yes, I agree that there are many people in America who when in high school, do not have access to advanced courses, and that is a terrible shame and prevents them from learning a lot of the things that they could learn in high school. However, I do not actually think that they need professors at a Stanford or Harvard type of place to teach courses like that, and I don't even think we're particularly good at it, okay? I think, yes, they could be taught by people much better than the people who are teaching them now, potentially, but that does not mean that actually you need to go right to the top of the highly selective institutions and grab those people to do it. So I think, yes, I'm all for it, but I don't think it has much to do with us, okay, frankly. Then it may have to do with a lot of non-selective post-secondary instructors, or some of them are fabulous instructors, and they're very good at instructing people at a level that would be appropriate for many high school students in the United States. On professional development and things like that, yes, I think there is a lot of role for online education to do things that lead to professional development, certificates, all kinds of things like that. You've got, that is a model of online education that we know is workable, because you have people who are motivated, they're engaged, they have a career, they're coming back to get something that is a skill they need to get. And whether they have to pay for it or whether a philanthropy pays for it because they're interested in giving it to people who couldn't otherwise afford it, that strikes me as a very reasonable thing to do. Okay, so a lot of professional development education, I would say, fits into that category. It's still not very much of what we do a lot of here, right? Stanford Graduate School of Education does a wonderful job educating its students, but it is not doing run-of-the-mill professional development for teachers. That's not what it does.
Hi, my name is Mike Spath. Thank you for that presentation. I've got a comment and then also a question. And the comment's sort of a chicken and egg thing. If you look at highly selective schools across the country, the schools are in different places, have different cost structures, have very different size of their endowments. Stanford's certainly near the top of that. And when you go, and I saw the earlier statement that someone who's paying fully for their cost is paying only 48% of the total cost. And the question is, it seems to, if you look at the tuition of all these highly selective schools, they're in a very, very tight band. Mm-hmm. And it seems very much more like a schools charging what the market will bear, helping out the people who need help to be able to afford that, and then having these other resources added on. And then at the end, it's like, okay, this is the cost of your education. And so the question for you is, if Stanford's endowment tomorrow jumped from 20 billion and doubled to 40 billion, and suddenly Stanford had all these significant, much more resources, my expectation would be that tuition would not move a bit, and that Stanford would find additional teachers to hire, additional things to incorporate into the education, and suddenly the cost of a Stanford education would go up significantly, and how much someone paying full tuition would now be even a lower percentage, maybe it's 30% or 25%. Okay, but when you come up with a cost of education, I view that as much more a reflection of total resources the university has to spend on a per student basis. So if you could comment on that, that'd be great. Thanks.
Okay, so that's a question with so much economic content that I would like to talk to you afterwards to some extent about it. This is a topic on which I work a lot. Let me just say that yes, our tuition and fees, what I'll call the sticker price, which not everyone pays, as you know. In fact, majority of students do not pay. That's what you pay if you're getting no financial aid. That is set by market forces. So it is probably not the case that if our endowment were to magically double, which we all hope happens, okay, that we would suddenly cut tuition to zero or something like that. Because as long as all of our peer institutions were still charging some amount of money, we probably wouldn't do that. It wouldn't really make a lot of sense to do that, in fact. If you think, I'm going to try to answer your question super briefly because it's a complicated question. But if you think, even within the highly selective sector, endowment per student drops very rapidly from the top endowed schools to the less endowed schools. But those schools are still competing with us for students, and they offer educations that are not that different from ours. Essentially, the price that we charge in terms of tuition and fees is set by market forces, and a lot of the market forces are driven by the less well-endowed institutions within that pool. Okay, so we can talk more about that, but they are the marginal players within that pool. We're not the marginal players within that pool. We actually have some experience, by the way, of institutions that have had vast increases in their endowment, and as a rule, they have used those both to improve their undergraduate student body and to do a bunch of other things. But one of the things they have done is they have offered more financial aid so that they could improve their student body.
Sir?
Wally Hawley, thank you, Carolyn, for your presentation. 2 questions. We have a second provost now who's specializing in online. I wonder if you could talk about what the mission is there, what will that encompass given what you've told us today, and where will Stanford go with that? Second question has to do with these companies that are trying to give it for free, but the argument is they think they'll get advertisements that'll make it work in the end that way.
Right.
I'd like your thoughts on that as well.
Okay, John Mitchell is now in charge of online education for us. He and I have talked a lot, and I think he has a really good understanding of the economics of online education, and I think he's very sophisticated about how Stanford is going to be part of this enormous wave of the future, but in a sophisticated, intelligent, thoughtful way that makes good use of Stanford's comparative advantages. So I think we're about as we should be very glad that we have him leading that part of the university. In terms of the platforms that want to give away content for free or almost for free or at very low cost and mean to support themselves via advertising, that is, of course, a model. So let's think about Google for a second. Everyone knows Google because we all use it all the time. How does Google sustain itself? It doesn't charge us any money to use their search engines, but by looking at all of our searches, they learn about our tastes, and then they can put ads in front of us, and that's how they sustain themselves. Right? It's an ad-based platform, and so I won't mention the names of some of the online education platforms that want to sustain themselves the same way. But you probably know the names. Many of you know the names off the top of their heads. I just don't want to pick out one and sort of single it out. They would need the same thing. Okay, so what does Google need? Google wants your identity. It wants to know what you search on, right? And it wants to keep that knowledge to itself. It doesn't want to share it with the rest of the world. Why? Because it wants to sell to advertisers. So now, similarly, if I'm an online platform and I'm offering MOOCs almost for free, what do I want? I want to know who's taking my courses. I want to know where they live, what they're interested in. I want their names. I want their locations. I want to know the things that I might be able to sell to them. Okay? And I don't want to share that information with anybody else because then no one's going to buy the ads on my platform instead of someone else's. So the question is, should we, as a Stanford or a Harvard or a University of Chicago or any other institution, give content to an online platform for free or nearly for free if we know that their economic incentive is to not let us know anything about those students, right? They will control that. They want to control the students for the ads. We will not know about the students. That is the economically sustainable advertising model, and that I think will potentially be a source of conflict between the platforms and these institutions. We create the content, costs us the money to create. No one is a faculty member who's working for most of those platforms. Most of their content is provided by someone else at some university who's being paid a salary by that university, who's worked for years at that university to create that course. We gave it to them for free, and they're not even going to now allow us to know who the students are who took the course. That's what I think is the potential conflict.
I'm going to take the opportunity to ask a question. My name is Mitchell Stevens. I'm a sociologist here in the Graduate School of Education. I know you painted this stark contrast for important analytic purposes, but one conversation we've been having here quite actively over the last few years is how do places like Stanford inherit the legacy in this country that we imagine higher education to be a plural organizational community, and in fact Stanford has certain obligations and responsibilities to be of service to the rest of the sector in ways that are reciprocally beneficial. So you've talked about two different worlds, two different business models. How might we think about the promise or possibility of cooperation among different kinds of institutions in reciprocally worthwhile ways?
Well, so I think the most obvious is the first simple idea, which is that even though we have a lot of peer institutions that in some ways look very much like us, okay? So let me just take MIT as an example. In some ways, you might say parts of Stanford and parts of MIT are interchangeable, but they're not really interchangeable institutions. There are a lot of courses that Stanford teaches and that MIT does not, and vice versa. Okay? They tend to be rather high-level courses. They both teach the same basic courses. Okay? Well, first of all, we could just have huge gains from trade in those courses that we teach and they don't teach and they teach and we don't teach. Every Stanford student who would really benefit from taking an MIT course that's advanced, let's do it. Let's do all those trades. Okay. So first of all, that's something that we can do that benefits the rest of society, and that it completely makes sense. What about our educating other educators in the United States? There are so many faculty at other institutions in the United States who teach and who would benefit tremendously from taking a course at a place like Stanford and learning the latest thing on some frontier of knowledge. Okay? And that benefits people broadly. There are many students around the world. I mean, just to be clear, we take a tiny, tiny percentage of the students who really could be at a place like Stanford and educate them. A tiny, tiny percentage. They do not make up most of the world, but there are a lot more than there are here on the campus. And so we could educate many more of them. And I really think that that's also part of our mission.
Can I push this a little bit? I mean, how should we be thinking about our relationship with entities like Foothill and De Anza College, which are just down the road from us, and with whom we have had cooperative relationships in the past? I mean, are they part of our future as well in this world, or?
Well, I think that they're part of our local community, and it makes a lot of sense to have local relationships with them in the same way we would otherwise. But once we get outside the local set of community colleges, do we wish to have a special reciprocal relationship with all of the other community colleges in the United States? Well, probably not. I mean, it's just not possible. And there's nothing special that would make us pick out some of them and not others of them. I think the local ones, it makes a lot of sense, just because there are all kinds of reasons why we all share a higher education community that's geographically based and certain resources, and I hope we continue with all of those types of things. But I'm not sure that online education makes us say, hey, let's abandon De Anza College and take up with some community college in New Jersey or some community college in Virginia or something like that. I don't know what we can't have reciprocal relationships with everybody.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
Wow. How about you? Yes, please stand and introduce yourself.
Hi, thank you. My name is Mariana. I'm a grad student at the International Comparative Education Program. And my question is about peer effects in higher selective post-secondary education institutions. And my question is, do you think these peer effects and the multiplying effect and all that is sustainable as well in the online model that you proposed?
Well, it is certainly the case that we believe almost everyone who teaches in a highly selective post-secondary institution, and most of the students here, believe that peers matter, okay? In fact, frankly, if peers didn't matter, it would be a little weird that we have so many activities that are peer-related, okay? So I think we can let's just take it as a given that students' peers matter. They could matter because they're learning things from one another. It could matter because if I don't have peers who have similar types of learning or different types of learning styles in my classroom, my instructor's going to teach me differently. It could be all the extracurricular things that they do. Online education lends itself to certain types of peer interactions, but it does not lend itself to all the types of peer interactions. It's a very narrow interaction compared to being on campus with people or being in the same classroom with people. So yes, it's still, there's some peer interactions that are going to take place, but I don't think it's a substitute for the on-campus type of peer interactions or the student-faculty interactions that take place on campus. That's a very different type of activity. It's more spontaneous. It's interacting in a different way. There's more give and take. It's more simultaneous. I think the other thing about online courses that make the interaction fundamentally different is you don't know very much about the person with whom you're interacting. You might know a little bit about that person, but think how much you know about the other students in your class by the end of the time you've taken a class with them that's an interactive class, or how much you know about the faculty member or the faculty member knows about you. That's a very different type of interaction because a lot of the interactions by the end of the course are predicated on that knowledge of one another that you have. And that's a different type of interaction than if I'm engaged with, John B, located in some place or another. So I think, I don't think it's really much of a substitute, frankly. I'm not saying that there are no peer interactions online that are valuable. I think there are some valuable ones, but I don't think we should think of them as a substitute for most of what goes on a college campus in person.
So please help me in thanking Carolyn.